Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Dyke, and I'm an Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this week's seminar with Ben Franta, Associate Professor of Climate Litigation and also leader of the Climate Litigation Lab at the University of Oxford. The plan is that Ben's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A until we get kicked out, which might be around 3:30, but let's see. But don't worry if we do get evicted, there's tea and coffee outside. There's also the remnants of another event that we can pick our way through and make sure we reduce any food waste on campus. And then also we've got the opportunity to continue discussion in the Ram bar or maybe Latouche or something. It's up to us. Right. So I'm particularly pleased that we've been able to get Ben to come down because he's a very busy person. Because the work that he has done, the work that he's currently doing, the things he's going to talk about today, I think are wonderful examples of how we can use research, academic practice to produce real-world change. And also, Ben, I think, embodies much of the ethos of the Global Systems Institute, which purports to be a interdisciplinary, not even transdisciplinary research group. And when it comes to Ben's academic journey, it might be easy to list the subjects he has not studied. He's got degrees in physics, archaeology, history, and law, and that includes 3 doctorates along the way. He's qualified for the bar in California, and I understand that's the harder bar exam. Yeah. And he's used this very broad transdisciplinary experience and training to, I think, begin to make meaningful impact on what we're going to do against the fight against climate change. And also, given that we're going to be talking about law, I need to mention some other esteemed visitors to the University of Exeter, Sarah Finch and Ali Rowe, whom independently have also been using the legal system, lawyers and the legal profession to actually make some progress. We've been banging our heads against state inaction on climate change for decades. We've been tearing our hair out for those, on corporate inaction and increasingly corporate rollback. So maybe the legal profession, maybe the legal system, maybe these are the kind of instruments that we need to begin to use to actually start bending the curve on emissions and doing what we said we were going to do in terms of our legal obligations to things like the Paris Agreement. So it's great, Ben, you've managed to come here. So all I have left to do is say, please join me in welcoming to the Global Systems Institute, Ben Franta.
Thanks, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think I was hoping to come here last year at some point, and it was just too busy and I couldn't make it. I think maybe I was traveling or something. But I'm really excited to be here now. And, you know, it's really nice to meet all of you. Last night we had a really nice dinner with some students and some of the activist leaders from Just Stop Oil. And I want to thank everyone, and I think especially the activists doing direct actions, for their leadership and their courage. Because we know that if we don't do things differently, then we're not going to get different outcomes. And we need different outcomes on climate change. So that's just my thank you to you. Okay, I'm gonna talk a little bit about climate change lawsuits. This is an area that has technically existed since the 1980s. There were lawsuits mentioning climate change even as far back as then. But in the last 10 years, they've really exploded around the world. And new types of lawsuits are being developed and filed now and pursued. And in particular, against fossil fuel companies directly. And that's a pretty new development, and it's very interesting. And I'll show you some of the evidence that's being brought in some of those lawsuits. I think, you know, I have so much material, I could go on for hours, so I'll probably give sort of an overview of the main points in about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion. As James mentioned, I lead a group at Oxford called the Climate Litigation Lab. We're very new, we're only a few years old, and our mission is to do research that helps drive these lawsuits forward. So we do evidentiary research, we do scientific research, we do investigative, historical research, we do legal research to figure out what sorts of lawsuits might work in different jurisdictions. You know, can we sue banks for greenwashing? You know, what if fossil fuel companies are lying to their investors about what they're actually doing with the company? Can they be sued for that? Under what laws? So those are some of the legal strategy questions we might examine. We've actually looked into some of those in particular. And so this is our team right now. It's sort of grown very rapidly. We do climate attribution research. We do a lot of work on greenwashing. We do some work in artificial intelligence. So we're building a kind of a ChatGPT type tool that allows users to search through huge bodies of evidentiary documents. So if you have, you know, say tens of thousands of pages of evidence documents and you want to know, do they talk about flooding from climate change or heat waves from climate change? When did they first know about climate change? Let's say they're internal documents from fossil fuel companies. We want to know what they knew when. Some people have read through all the documents, but it takes a long time, years. That's what people do their PhDs on. With this tool, you can just ask it, and it will give you the answer, or an answer, like a large language model generated answer, and then cite specifically which documents it's getting information from and link you back to the primary document so that you can verify the accuracy of the information. So we're hopeful that that's useful for journalists and researchers and lawyers bringing more lawsuits. We've done some work with human rights, worked with human rights courts. So we do all sorts of things, just whatever information generation is useful for lawsuits. Okay, so I want to show you a little video, it's like 5 minutes long, of one lawsuit being announced. This is the state of California announcing that the state itself, through the Attorney General of the state, is suing the carbon majors, companies like ExxonMobil and Shell and Chevron, for concealing what they knew about climate change and through fossil fuels causing a huge amount of damage to the state of California. And so this lawsuit is trying to recover money back from the fossil fuel companies. Very interesting because if something like that were to succeed, then it would internalize all those costs that are related to climate change back to the fossil fuel companies, and it would change the economics of the fossil fuel business. So let's look at this announcement. And what I find very interesting about this 5 minutes is that it's combining, of course, the lawsuit, but the narrative. There's a narrative here about the origins of the climate problem and the solutions to the climate problem. And using language that I think many of us have only heard from activist groups and social movements, but now being adopted by lawyers and political leaders as well. So this is the Attorney General of California on the right, and then the Governor of California on the left.
Good afternoon, everybody. Rob Bonta, California
I'll turn up the audio a little bit.
Attorney General, excited to be here with our great, courageous, and bold governor and to announce a very important lawsuit that we filed on Friday, late night.
There's a little bit of California bragging in here. I just want to warn you, so bear with that, but try to forgive it.
In San Francisco Superior Court in California, where we are suing some of the biggest fossil fuel industry leaders, big oil, from ConocoPhillips to BP to Chevron, Shell, ExxonMobil, as well as the American Petroleum Institute, in a first of its kind, watershed, historic, unprecedented lawsuit by the biggest state in the nation, the soon to be fourth largest economy in the world, the largest geographic area, and the biggest economy yet to sue these companies for fueling climate change and for lying about it. That is the essence of it. It's that deception, those misleading statements, that falsifying over decades, 60, 70 years. And we have a very detailed complaint full of evidence showing studies that were commissioned and internal memos and internal dialogue where leaders of these big oil companies knew exactly what fossil fuel did to the climate change, the increased heat. They predicted very accurately where we are today. They knew it was coming and they did it anyway. And they, while they huddled internally and privately and told the truth to one another about the facts and science of climate change, they lied to the rest of the world. And so we have a detailed complaint that has a number of different causes of action. It is the most sweeping complaint thus far to sue these companies for fueling climate change and for deceiving. It has a public nuisance claim. It has a destruction of natural resources claim. It has a number of false and misleading statement and deception claims. It has failure to warn claims in it as well. And the main remedy it seeks is an abatement fund to abate and mitigate the impacts of climate change. As the governor has said many times, as the hots get hotter, as the wets get wetter, the dries get drier, that has impact on people and on natural resources and on our state. And right now, the big oil companies have pushed the costs all onto the people, to the taxpayers and everyday folks who are sick because of the air that they breathe or are suffering because of the heat that they work in, who can't afford insurance or are getting insurance pulled away from them, who are losing their homes, losing their farms. Those are all costs that are externalized, that are borne by the people because of the acts and conducts of big oil companies. So they need to be held accountable. They need to pay for the damage that they caused, that they knew about. They knew for years. They knew where we would be today. They predicted it accurately. And in their endless pursuit, their unquenchable thirst for billions of dollars of profit year after year, 200 billion last year, they continued to lie so they could profit while the planet burned, California burned, flooded, suffered drought, suffered super storms. So we believe that this is a historic moment. We hope that this will be an inspiration to other states and other entities to get involved, to join us, to sue, to be part of an effort to hold an industry accountable that has not been held accountable for too long. And I just want to end with this. This is personal. This is personal to a lot of us. The governor shared some very personal statements earlier today about one of his children. I have the same experience. I have my oldest daughter told me in high school. She's now 24 years old. I'm going to brag here for a second. She's a professional soccer player. But she told me when she was in high school, she said, "Dad, I love our family. My younger brother, my younger sister, mom and dad, and I want to have a family of my own someday. I've always dreamed about that, but right now I don't think I can. I don't think I should, and I'm not planning on it. I don't think it's responsible to bring a new life into a dying planet." And she's worried whether she's going to have a planet, have a family to enjoy with. And we have a responsibility to do more. California is doing what we do here, leading, leaning in, being bold, being strong, being aggressive, and holding to account an industry that has not been held to account for too long. So we're happy to answer some questions, but very, very, very proud to
I'm
be
ready
the
to
governor.
step aside and let's just do Q&A. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any sort of like reactions to that or thoughts, in response to that sort of presentation? Yeah.
It just reminds me of suing the tobacco companies, but that seems like an easier thing to prove, right? So they went back again and showed they knew about the health risks of tobacco before.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. So it's a little bit like suing the tobacco companies, but maybe it was easier to prove the tobacco case since they had all those documents, right, that showed that tobacco companies understood the addictive nature of nicotine and the disease-causing effects of tobacco. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I don't know about California, but I obsess about fossil fuel subsidies all the time.
Yeah.
Is California the state at the same time they're doing this subsidizing fossil fuel industry? Would that be a good defense? You don't really believe in it because look.
Yeah. So, what about California as one of the major oil and gas producers in the United States as a state, right? So what about that? And are they subsidizing oil and gas? I don't know the answer to that particular aspect, but California does produce a lot of oil and gas, right? And so, one of the defenses at one point in some of these cases was the oil companies said, well, the state governments were selling, bonds or something like that based on, or they're selling, property or something that they knew that would be destroyed by climate change, so they assumed some risk or something like that. So that hasn't worked yet as a defense, but there is that wrinkle. And I think that that's why the plaintiffs are focusing so much on the corporate deception angle. It's not just the fact of selling fossil fuels, it's not telling the truth about it. And that's the basis for liability, at least in these cases as they're being presented to the public. So it's very similar to tobacco in that sense. Or opioid litigation, if you know about that, with addictive opioid pharmaceuticals, which many people got addicted to and became addicted to heroin as a result, and many people died. So, that's another example of what we call a mass tort. It often in the legal profession, where you sue the whole industry for doing something bad related to its products, to force them to pay and tell the truth, and maybe other remedies as well. So thank you for that. I think that it's just interesting to reflect on that. Yeah.
Yeah, got a couple of comments. Seems like such a good idea. Why isn't everyone doing it?
Yes.
Doesn't the political nature of the US Supreme Court and the president make this kind of challenge more difficult to win?
It very well may. So yeah, there's a couple of questions there where, why isn't everyone doing this? And there are about 30 suits of this type occurring currently in the US. There are many more kinds of climate lawsuits happening all around the world, which we'll talk about. But this is when this was filed, which was about a year and a bit ago, it was the biggest example of it so far. There were some early movers, some cities and counties in the US, and then now more states. And the Supreme Court has just made a decision that would allow these cases to move forward to trial. So now we might see more cases like this filed pretty soon. Because there's an interesting part to the economics of this. The way these cases work is that, the Attorney General of California, they don't have enough people to take on Exxon and Chevron and Shell, all of them themselves. So they'll hire outside lawyers to help them. And the way the case works often is that if they win, then those outside lawyers get some of the money that's recovered, some fraction. If they lose, the outside lawyers get no money. And so you kind of have this new type of lawyer who is now engaged in climate, who is used to betting everything on winning, a big case that might take a decade of their life against a big industry who has way more money than way more people, but they know how to win these cases. So this is kind of a different type of lawyer now getting involved in the climate issue, which I think is interesting in terms of like the sociology of who's involved in the climate movement and what are the resources that are being brought into it. Yeah.
Flip side to the why isn't everyone doing this question? What about everyone else? In terms, so yes, California,
Yeah.
economy or whatever can do it, but in terms of, and you said it takes 10 years even for this one case. So if they do get this kind of abate, whatever, does that then have to be replicated in every state in the US and every state else in the world and every city and everything? How, in terms of a strategy for justice or some kind of reparations or compensation, does that then have to be replicated literally everywhere, and is that accessible?
Yeah, this is a great question. So what about other places around the world? What about the whole world, being impacted by climate change? So there's kind of a good news and bad news aspect, I think, to the answer. The good news is that if somebody files a case now, they don't necessarily have to wait 10 years because the last 5 years have already been litigated. And so the cases have kind of moved to that point. So if a new case is filed, it sort of moves to the front with the rest of the pack. So it's sort of like 10 years for the whole issue to get resolved. But the bad news is that, well, it depends on how you look at it, but it might be considered bad news that not every part of the world has a legal system that is able to accommodate these sorts of claims. And in particular, the US is particularly strong at this sort of a lawsuit where you sue a company for a lot of money. based on alleged deception. Now, what the US doesn't really do is like human rights law, like we just don't do that basically. But the rest, many parts of the world do, right? So different avenues of legal action are available in different parts of the world. And that's part of that, of studying this field, is figuring out where do certain legal strategies work in which places, and how can they work together and be synergistic with each other. So here's, some coverage of that suit. Here's a map of the various government suits around the US so far. You'll see Puerto Rico has 38 suits. Municipalities of Puerto Rico have sued the oil companies for causing damage through Hurricane Maria, which struck the island in I think it was 2018. It caused about $100 billion in damage. We zoom out, this is a map of climate-related cases around the world. And so we can see it's, there's some spread. A lot of it's concentrated in the US. If you look at the number of cases, it jumps from 130 to 135 to 1,590. So the scale jumps a lot, and there's just a lot of litigation occurring in the US, but it's spread out in different kinds of cases that are also very impactful potentially are happening around the world. Here's the number of climate-related cases over time filed. Generally a pretty huge growth over the last 10 years or so. I think there's been kind of a big wave and then a slowdown while some of the current cases are resolved, because there's some big cases that are ongoing. And then just to give a few examples, do you want to take a photo of that, James? Just to give a few examples of suits. Some of these suits are about just false advertising, essentially. I mean, we've probably all seen the ads from Exxon that talk about, they're doing a lot of carbon capture, or they're developing climate solutions, or even if you fly, you'll see we are sustainable or something like that, right? That ad. And so some of these suits are just saying, look, these are greenwashing, these are false, and we have to address these. So Massachusetts, state of Massachusetts, for example, sued ExxonMobil over this issue. And in their complaint, they even make that comparison to tobacco, like you mentioned. And they're making this point. If we look at this tobacco ad, there's nothing in the ad that's technically false, right? It's just saying, I smoke this cigarette, but it's the imagery, right? It's implying that if you want to be healthy and attractive and fit, then you should smoke this brand of cigarette. And that's, misleading. So that's what a lot of the green advertising is something like ExxonMobil advancing climate solutions. It's kind of vague. It's like, is this really true or not true? But it's giving the overall misleading impression that the company is part of the solution to climate change, rather than one of the main causes to the problem. This is the Puerto Rico suits, and it's using a law called RICO, which is an organized crime, like a law to fight organized crime and conspiracies. That's a very interesting cause of action. That's just a New York Times feature on one of the lawyers bringing the case. Another kind of case based on a particular individual event is this case brought by a county in Oregon, where Portland, Oregon is, and they had a big heat wave or heat dome in 2021. And there was some climate attribution research done that showed that basically this heat dome was virtually impossible without climate change. And so the causation link is strong enough, and they brought this suit seeking damages based on that claim, or that event. So some of these suits are based on individual events, and some are based on kind of all the damages from climate change in general in a place. That's like the California suit. And then we see suits like this outside the US as well. You might have heard about this suit because it's been going on for a while. This is this Peruvian farmer where the town sits below this glacial lake. And as the glacier melts, it's more likely that the lake will catastrophically burst and flood the town. And so they're seeking money to adapt and prepare. And so they sued a German heavily coal-fired utility company for damages to pay for the adaptation based on the fraction of global emissions that utility is responsible for. So it's sort of an interesting test case. It's been going on for a long time. It's more about testing like whether this is doable legally. But the judge, it wasn't thrown out, immediately. It's been ongoing. And then other cases have sued governments to try to force them to align with the Paris Agreement. So you might know that the substance of the Paris Agreement, the climate goals of the Paris Agreement, they're not legally binding. Like the procedures of the agreement are. But actually holding climate change to 1.5 or 2 degrees, that's not legally binding. Now, what these lawsuits are trying to do is make that legally binding by bringing suits against the governments and saying, actually, the Paris Agreement is an accepted standard. Everyone or enough people have agreed to it around the world that it's an accepted standard, and under our own sort of constitutional laws or duty of care laws, that should be legally required, that the government needs to try to do that to protect its own people from climate change as much as it can. So that's sort of the theory, and they'll bring in other human rights laws to strengthen the argument and so on. And so this was a big case, the Urgenda case in the Netherlands against the Dutch government, and that succeeded. It was a case of this type. It was a really big deal. Went all the way to the top court in the Netherlands and was upheld. And then essentially the exact same suit was filed against Shell in the Netherlands. So this is like the corporate version of that. And that is in progress. So the low court basically replicated the earlier judgment and said Shell needs to decarbonize in line with the Paris Agreement, which meant that Shell basically needed to get off of fossil fuels like immediately, like reduce the amount of fossil fuel they sell by half by 2030. So that's a big deal. and so Shell appealed that decision, and then this appeals court just a few months ago now reversed the remedy. So the appeals court said, yes, fossil fuel companies have a legally binding obligation to mitigate climate change. They have an obligation to align with the Paris Agreement, but this particular order to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 and so on, we're not going to do that because it's too specific. It's sort of like the court didn't like how precise it was. The court felt like it was too prescriptive, didn't give Shell enough freedom to figure out how to do it. So, people had different opinions about that reasoning. And so now that will be appealed to the Supreme Court of the Netherlands. But it's an interesting example of this other track of climate litigation. And this is really powerful too, because, if this theory works, then, BP could potentially be sued. Many oil companies, many fossil fuel producers could be sued under this theory and forced to move away from fossil fuels as a matter of law. And then there's other suits. There's one in Italy that is both the damages and the mitigation remedies put together. So it's kind of combining those things. Another transnational case. This is claimants in Indonesia suing a cement producer in Switzerland for climate damages. And the idea here is that even though Switzerland's a small country, a lot of commerce goes through Switzerland. And so if they have a law that says companies operating there have to align with the Paris Agreement and may be liable for damages resulting from them causing climate change, that would affect a lot of business around the world, right? So there's kind of a strategic aspect to this case that might not be obvious at first. And then right now, there are a bunch of things happening in international courts and human rights. So there was recently a big case in the European Court of Human Rights, the Klimasignorinen case, where a group of older Swiss women argued to the court that they were particularly vulnerable to heat waves and other impacts of climate change. And so they were a special class that should be recognized by the court, and that the government of Switzerland was not doing enough to fight climate change, and that was violating the human rights of those claimants under the European Convention on Human Rights, and the court agreed with them and ordered the government of Switzerland to do more on climate change. The government of Switzerland said, no, we're not going to do anything different. That's the last I heard, at least. That might change. But so there is this sort of fight that's brewing, you know, on the human rights front as well. And then, you know, there have been some interesting, what we call advisory opinions. An advisory opinion is where it's not like one group is suing another group. It's more like someone goes to the court and says, can you clarify what the law is around this issue for you know, future reference? And so the first advisory opinion to come out was last year, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which I had never heard of until I got into this field. But this is an interesting court to do with maritime law and things like that. And they said that greenhouse gases are marine pollutants legally, and they should be minimized as a matter of law for anyone who's part of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is like almost everyone around the world. So that's like a really interesting legal hook. And the way this kind of works is the international courts clarify what the law is, and then cases are brought in domestic courts and national courts to try to enforce that aspect of law. So that may be picked up in the future. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, another regional human rights court based in Costa Rica, is writing an advisory opinion on climate change and human rights right now, and they're expected to be out with that later this year. And then the International Court of Justice, which is sort of the top international court of this kind, is also writing an advisory opinion, which should be out, I think, either towards the end of this calendar year or maybe the beginning of next. So all of that will reshape international law with regard to climate change. And then I'm sure that will all be picked up by litigators and used in cases in different countries around the world. So it's a very interesting, like rapidly developing field. There are a bunch of other legal theories that are being pursued, like suing banks for financing fossil fuel production, forcing fossil fuel companies to clean up abandoned wells. There are tons of millions and millions of abandoned wells around the world. There's an interesting set of cases suing fossil fuel companies for not adapting their own infrastructure to climate change. So it puts them in this weird posture where they kind of have to argue that they have adapted to climate change. But you know, then that kind of looks strange because for many years they were saying, don't worry about climate change. So those are an interesting set of cases. Yes, this is the Finch slide. Yes, so we have a hero here, actually. Sarah Finch is here. So this was a really, really important case because it found that environmental projects to obtain permitting in the UK, they need to consider the downstream climate change effects of projects. And so that applies to so many things. Yes, this is a good photo. Amazing.
Send it to you, Ben.
Yes, please do. So I'm going to skip through some of this other stuff. You know, there have been some other victories. There's been discussion of applying criminal law to fossil fuel companies, which is an interesting idea. There's plastics litigation, which is not quite climate, but it's a lot of the same defendants and very similar kind of theory. So some polling's been done, and it's found that litigation, suing for climate change, is actually like more popular than believing in climate change. If that makes sense. There's something about, you know, people do not like being lied to, especially the corporate accountability type litigation. It's pretty broadly supported. So this is, you know, US, so take this with a grain of salt. But you know, here we have, you know, most Republicans like climate litigation against fossil fuel companies, and you know, and many Democrats like it too. So it has this sort of bipartisan support. And you know, the opioid litigation in the US was started by like super conservative attorneys general and stuff. So there's kind of an interesting aspect to that. So we're I'm going to skip over a bunch of stuff, and I'm just going to show you some of the highlights, because these cases are based on kind of maybe three aspects. So one is the historical failure of these companies to disclose what they knew about climate change. And often they said the opposite of what now we know that they knew. Another part is the ongoing greenwashing of the companies. And then there's the damages part, which is about causation. You know, how did that conduct lead to damage? So we don't have a ton of time, so I'm just gonna kind of go through a few things. The historical stuff is super interesting. It turns out fossil fuel companies have been warned for a long time about climate change. This is from the 1950s. The physicist Edward Teller gave a keynote speech to an oil conference where he warned about climate change from fossil fuels. I'm going to go very quickly, but you can probably see the slides later. We know now that in the late 70s, Exxon put together a secret research program about climate change. And it was very sophisticated and made a lot of accurate predictions. You know, here's from one of the documents, Exxon's projection of how much global warming we'd have by 2050. So they projected 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. They, you know, even thought maybe global warming was already happening a little bit, but it was not detectable yet because it was too small compared to natural variability, but there was no doubt that it would occur in the future. And there's some amazing quotes from these documents. So these are internal memos from ExxonMobil from the late 70s. I'll skip ahead a little bit. This is another memo. This is another kind of amazing plot because it shows the year from 1960 to 2100, and this is how much global warming we would expect if kind of under business as usual, and then how much CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere. And basically it's right on. You know, by 2025, we've got about 420 parts per million and about 1.2 degrees Celsius of global warming. So, you know, this has been, you know, really accurate. And, you know, this was 1982. And so, you know, it kind of just goes to show that the important things about climate change, the most important things, were already understood. You know, the climate sensitivity, there was a consensus about that by the late 70s. The fact that fossil fuels were the main cause of climate change was understood by that time. And so the solution of needing to get off of fossil fuels was also understood. And these are just some more quotes. Potentially catastrophic effects, flooding, climate-related famine or migration. Oh, there's some cutoff here, but partial adaptation costs says a few percent of gross national product. That's like hundreds of billions of dollars in the US. And some academic papers have put all of these projections together, and that's all these gray lines from Exxon's papers, and compared them to actual warming, and just to show that it's not cherry picking. It's not like just, you know, one happened to be correct, but really they clustered around the right answer. So let's see, I'm gonna kind of skip ahead, I think, because I want to make sure we have time. So there's more of this Exxon, many Exxon documents. These are actually online if you want to see them. There were Exxon memos about how to prevent catastrophic climate change, and basically that we had to leave it in the ground. There's a memo that says 80%, you know, 80% of fossil fuel must stay in the ground. This is like how to prevent serious climate change. This is in 1979. So the solutions were understood. I'm going to skip ahead here again. These are just more impacts. The American Petroleum Institute, which is a big trade association, had a secret task force on climate change as well. And so these are the minutes of one of its meetings, and we have representatives from, this is now BP, this is now Chevron, Exxon. And, you know, this is again, warning of what will happen if we don't get off of fossil fuels. 1 degree of global warming by 2005, and then more, with eventually globally catastrophic effects. So there's like really profound language in here. And, you know, the idea says market penetration time theory says there's no leeway, so time for action. And the idea is that even then it was understood that to replace fossil fuels with another energy source, it would take decades because these are huge infrastructural systems. So that meant to prevent this serious climate change, they needed to start acting right away. This is back in 1980. So that this was like discussed and understood. And all of that recast all the delay afterwards in a new light, because it shows that these companies well understood that any delay was going to have very serious consequences and very damaging impacts. I'm going to skip ahead through some of this just to show that Shell also had internal documents. So this is like a really interesting document. It was just found a couple years ago by a graduate student in the Netherlands. It's Shell's internal scenarios report from 1989, and it's all about climate change. You can see the greenhouse effect schematic. That's like the stick figure on the cover. And here are the different scenarios. It's a little blurry, but you've got two scenarios here. This is emissions, annual emissions. GM is global mercantilism scenario. It's kind of like business as usual, or emissions could go down starting around the year 2000 under the sustainable world scenario. And this is how much CO2 accumulation you'd get, about 400 parts per million under sustainable world, and it would just keep going up for the business as usual. And here are the predicted effects of, a lot of this is cut off, but I think you can see the point. And I think it says at the end, like, civilization could prove a fragile thing or something like that. So it's, really like alarming language from the fossil fuel companies themselves, which is amazing. All right, I'm going to skip through all of this, but suffice it to say that, there's a body of scholarship on how the fossil fuel industry denied the reality of climate change after that and slowed down any policy efforts to deal with the problem. So we have like the membership lists of the denialist organizations, which had a lot of the petrochemical and fossil fuel interests on it. We see things like this. Climate scientists don't say that fossil fuels are steadily warming the earth. This is in the 90s in national newspapers. So really overt climate denial that completely contradicts what these companies knew internally. There's like an academic environmental sociology literature on this. So that's kind of why I'm going to skip ahead. Okay, so that's why these lawsuits are focusing on the deception of the fossil fuel companies. It's like the tobacco cases. And even this is an article in the Wall Street Journal from maybe a year, I guess it's almost a year and a half ago now. But even the Wall Street Journal, which is like a friend to capitalism, is saying these companies deceive the public and they're doing their own investigations. And this is the defense from the oil companies. They say, I know how it looks bad, but these are good people. All that matters is now we're solving the problem, essentially. But if we actually look at how much these companies are spending on renewables, it's not very much. So this data is a little bit old. It's from 2022, but here we have like Exxon. The American oil majors are spending 0% on renewables. This is their capital investments. And the European ones are spending more, but still way more in fossil fuels. And yet they're branding themselves as green. And so that kind of gets us into this greenwashing thing. And what's interesting about the law is that it doesn't just prohibit statements that are technically false, because people can mislead other people by telling the truth and by leaving things out, right? Sometimes that's more effective than just saying something that's wrong. So that's also prohibited, that if something is overall misleading because it's so vague or it's omitting certain facts or misleading emphasis. So, oh yes, let's see if we can watch this. This might work. Let's try it.
Some farms grow food. This one grows fuel. ExxonMobil is growing algae for biofuels that could one day power planes, propel ships, and fuel trucks, and cut their emissions in half. Algae, its potential just keeps growing.
Okay, so Exxon had this algae biofuels ad campaign for about 10 years, but it never sold any algae biofuel, never had a product to sell algae biofuel. So these are the sorts of ads that are kind of at issue here, and we see a lot of them. I tried to, sorry, the formatting is kind of a little messed up, but these are some of the claims we see in these ads. The company is generally sustainable, or a big one is promoting fossil gas, natural gas as climate solution or low carbon, and it often just ignores all the methane emissions associated with gas. Promoting offsets as more effective than they actually are, or saying efficiency is the solution to climate change, things like that. So we've actually put together, we have a whole bunch of examples of ads like this, and I'll kind of skip over them. There are just so many. Like, let's see, 40% of all human-produced CO2 captured comes from ExxonMobil, right? That might be true, but maybe there's not that much in the first place, right? And so this could mislead people into thinking that's actually significant. Hydrogen production with carbon capture, one of the ways we're advancing climate solutions, that's an Exxon ad. I'm wondering how much of that they're actually doing. How much hydrogen with CCS are they actually doing? We have other examples. I'm going to skip through them just to show you something. Well, this is interesting. So a study that came out from Influence Map in 2021 found that about half or more of ads from the carbon majors were green themed. So it's a lot of the ads are this way. And so we've put together this database at Oxford in our group called the Oxford Carbon and Climate Advertising Library, where we have so far we've got about 1,700 ads from the fossil fuel companies that are climate themed. And so we have like the creative content, the transcripts, and we can share this with other researchers. So if you're interested in accessing these data for your research or for your thesis or whatever, just let us know and we can share this data with you. Okay, I think I'm going to skip ahead because I want to end so that we have time for questions. But the last thing I'll say is just the bit on the damages. So we have all of this evidence on like historical deception by the companies, but how do we link the conduct of the companies to damage? That's a key part as well. And so this is kind of an emerging area of science. These are some of the leading researchers in the space, actually, Callahan and Mencken. And they have these damage functions, which they apply to climate change. So they'll say there's so much damage per degree of global warming through heat waves. And then they'll figure out how much extra global warming is caused by a company's emissions. And then they'll attribute the damage to those emissions. So there's it's an interesting approach. So like here, for example, they estimate that just through extreme heat, almost $1 trillion of losses have occurred in India, just India. And $70 billion are just from American emissions. So you can get these interesting attributions of damage and costs. Lots more studies on this. Some have just been more bottom up and asked, if we build seawalls, how much does that cost? And so this one found $400 billion in the US for seawalls. But these are probably underestimates. Like this study found it was like $100 billion in damages just in San Francisco Bay alone, which is like a relatively small geographic area. There's a lot of focus on Hawaii. They have a big climate lawsuit going on. And then the last thing I'll mention is sort of a trend to pass laws just to figure out how much damage has happened in a place, and then send a bill to the fossil fuel companies for the damage. And so 2 states so far have passed these laws in the US, Vermont and New York, and other states are debating it. And so we think this is pretty interesting. And so something we're working on is helping the state of Vermont figure out how much damage climate change has caused in the state so that they can implement this cost recovery law. And so we're looking at hurricanes. So hurricanes form, and then they become extratropical cyclones, and they kind of hit this part of the US and they cause flooding. And that's the main kind of impact in Vermont, influenced by climate change, as far as we can tell. And so we're doing some research to figure that out. How much extra flooding in the place is there because of climate change? So there's like a wide variety. I'll kind of leave it there. But there's a wide variety of work that kind of feeds into these legal actions, and of course isn't just useful for legal actions, but also for public awareness and research and journalism and things like that too. So I think I went a little long, but yeah, I kind of rushed through a bunch of stuff. I had put too much in. But thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Well, I don't see anybody outside the door, so I don't know if anyone's going to kick us out. I just want to check. He's going to kick us out. Right. Do you want to do online? Then we do.
I have a question. Yes. Wow, amazing. I mean, yeah. What can scientists do to get involved and to help you? Are there specific things that you need from the scientific community, physical scientists?
It's a great question. So how can scientists get involved? Specifically with legal action, by conducting research that could be useful for legal actions. So I think the climate attribution science is really impactful, but also there's an economic angle to that as well, or just other types of impacts, because damages from climate change don't have to just be economic damages. They could be cultural. So like, let's say someone's an anthropologist, or we were talking about coral reef impacts earlier today, coral reef bleaching. So I think whatever your discipline is, there's a way to better understand the damage that climate change is causing to people and to nature, and feeding that into legal action. In addition to that, being an expert witness is a really impactful way for scientists to engage with cases. And I think part of that is being willing to step out maybe of the comfort zone. So, many scientists, I used to be a physicist, and there was sort of this idea that there was the political realm and the social realm, and then there was the scientific realm. And to step into the law might feel a little like stepping out of science or something like that. And so, but we need the scientists, because we need that scientific information injected into the cases. So that's another important way to have a big impact as a scientist. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. I come from a background of direct action and things, and in the UK courts, we've definitely seen, and I guess it's another side of climate change litigation, which is that, the way that protest and climate protest is policed, and the way it gets, sent through the courts and stuff. So a big experience of myself, and I think of everyone in the UK, and this has been replicated across Europe and in other countries, is that there were some wins, but then very swiftly over the last couple of years, we've seen the laws change, we've seen the culture among the judiciary change, and suddenly the wins aren't coming anymore, and the prison sentences are longer, and it's quite a depressing field of law to be involved in, because you don't get very many wins. So I'm curious to know if there's a sort of specifically like around the culture of the judiciary in these cases, like are the judges like willing to hear about this stuff, and then as soon as the culture changes, with a new presidency and all of that sort of stuff, are they suddenly not that willing to care, and these things get thrown out for nothing more than a bad culture?
Mm-hmm. It's such a important and I think a really challenging question. Because dealing with the criminal court system, legal system, is very different from dealing with civil actions like the ones I talked about. A huge amount is at stake in a criminal case, and there's a big power imbalance. And, I think I don't have a ton of wisdom. I used to participate in civil disobedience actions, but they were relatively low stakes compared to what some of the people in this room are doing or have done. So I don't really feel like I have a lot of wisdom other than just to think about what is the, strategic endpoint of that, say, civil disobedience campaign, and maybe the purpose is to see what can be done without a prison sentence. But maybe the purpose is to accept the prison sentence, to expose the unjust nature of the system. It's like much easier said than done, of course. So, just thinking through that and not having any, I don't know, I don't have any sort of, these things are very easy to like speculate about, but they're much harder to do. So yeah, but yeah, I just want to thank again everyone who has put themselves on the line in that way here.
I want to say we've run out of time, but maybe there could be a very brief comment, because I'm getting evil eyes from outside.
Really quickly, I just want to share Lawyers Are Responsible. If you look on the website, we commissioned a KC opinion, and it's about employment law. So in answer to your question, what can you do as a scientist? You can download this opinion, you take it into your HR department, and it'll allow you to refuse fossil fuel work. So you can just, it's an option alongside protesting. It's about employment disruption. And I'll give you the link. Thanks,
you.
Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, if you do want to come and have a chat with Ben, then please do hang out outside of this room, because we have to go.
Yeah.
And I just want to say thanks again. Thanks,
Thank
Ben.
you.
Thanks everybody online. Thanks for everyone coming. We have a role to play, and some of that means for some people putting yourself on the line and putting your liberty on the line. And some people in our audience have been in prison, and maybe some of them might be in prison in the not too distant future. Maybe we as a university community could do everything we can to show our solidarity and support them, whatever they are trying to do. So thank you for that. Thank you.